Thank you all for coming. I think there are more of us up here than there are out there. No, not quite. This is my first official event for this book, which comes out next week. And I'm so excited to be joined by my dear friends. I thought that you can't write a book about things like humility and stand up at a podium, talk about why you're humble. So it's very important to me that this book get experienced in groups of people and through conversation, and I hope we'll have a conversation at the end about some of these ideas. I thought I would begin tonight by reading a little passage from the book for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it yet. We are posting some excerpts all this week and next week through the month of May on Design Observers. So for those of you who are hungry for more, they will be there. One afternoon when I was about 8 years old, a boy in my class gave me a box of candy, individually wrapped penny candy sticks as they were known back then, in what I can only imagine was a gesture of kindness or flirtation, or perhaps even love. I am reasonably certain that I had no romantic interest in the boy, but I melted inwardly at the thought of such massive quantities of candy within my reach. I also knew there was no conceivable way my parents would let me keep, let alone eat any of it, given the sober realities of what was at the time our decidedly sugar-averse household. So I did what any other shamelessly calculating third grader would do. I sold the candy sticks individually to my friends, earning approximately $9, and then I bought a Barbie. This brief anecdote speaks to many things, from the absurdity of illicit transactions on the black market schoolyard to the comparatively nonsensical dietary fascism of my family, to the way all of us inject profoundly personal meaning into inanimate objects. But mostly it speaks to want. The things we want are part of an endless and endlessly shifting list informed by high culture and low culture, nature and nurture, whim and whimsy. Some things we want are practical: faster laptops, lower taxes, cheaper airfares. Some are wishful: flawless beauty, endless youth. Often, the qualities framing our wants are mercurial, personal, and lean toward the hyperbolic: better, faster, cheaper. The role the designer plays in cultivating that want relies on numerous factors. Some of them are pragmatic, others seductive, making design practice a tricky orchestration of need, what the thing has to do, and novelty, convincing yourself that the best way to do it is with a new thing. To engage the eye while simultaneously lassoing consumer loyalty is the stuff of branding, but at its core, it's all about an enduring desire that links a person to a designated thing for as long as it is humanly possible to do so. To want something is to convince yourself you need it, or you deserve it, or both. To this end, the line between connoisseurship and consumerism is tenuous. Taste, ever personal, trumps the arguably tricker role of good judgment, and the ethics of choice are instantly exposed. My own children were outraged recently when I chose to buy a pre-owned Mini Cooper instead of a brand new electric car. No amount of argument on behalf of budget, mine, or range anxiety, mine again, or even the resultant relatively low impact on the planet, after all this was a Mini Cooper and not a Cadillac Escalade, swayed their opinion of me or of this decision, which was, in their view, a pitch-perfect example of social irresponsibility writ large. Their mother was the enemy who privileged design over duty. Simply put, if you want something badly enough, you can convince yourself you need it, as I did with my Mini Cooper. And while a great advertising campaign may result in higher sales figures, or a beautifully designed concert poster may lure more ticket buyers, the cause and effect relationship between desire and design does not always manifest through such simple, quantifiable transactions. In the end, in the modern world, design has become democratic, universal, which at once boosts and eviscerates its value. It's become a thing in and of itself, a machine for making, a vehicle for delivering messages, taping performances, mapping services, extending communications, and affirming storage capacities. If we yearn for devices, it is because we've convinced ourselves that ownership of such devices virtually liberates us from the burdens of a task-driven existence. if our desire to buy and own things that free us from toil is what fundamentally marks this generation from the last, or for that matter, from the next, then we persist in these choices at our peril. Desire is emotional and messy, idiosyncratic, and anything but rational. The things we want make us who we are, and if we all want the same things, or worse, if our desire for those things shepherds us down the same identical path to uniform desire, then the fulfillment of the international style may reveal itself as a truly dystopian legacy, hardly what any of us had hoped. So I'm joined by my dear friends who are here to talk about some of the topics in this book. The book is an unusual book that really came to me several years ago when I was asked by Yale University Press to write a book that was tentatively at that time entitled Why Design Matters. I thought, okay, why design matters? It was part of a bigger series that Yale's doing on why things matter. Alice Waters is doing the one on food, and David Reif is doing the one on politics. And they asked a number of people in a number of fields to talk about the most important things about the thing they do. And I thought, a lot of books have been written about design, about what it looks like, about how it performs, about why it's meaningful. But we live in an age in which anybody with an Instagram feed thinks they're visually literate. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper. And so I went off to Paris for 6 months, and I sat in near monastic conditions at my kitchen table. And I thought really hard about why design mattered. And what came to me was that, in fact, if you get past that Instagram feed, everybody is visual. Everybody traffics in visual relationships and communication and email and screens. But we're not thinking enough about other things like consequence and patience and humility and authority and all the things that actually, as designers, I think have a much more potentially lasting impact on the contributions that we make. And so I set out to write this book. The book is illustrated by a series of paintings that I made that are based on soft tissue histologies inside the human body. And these are based on the fact that I came across this wonderful quote by Agnes Martin, who said that on the inside we all look alike. It's what we do with it that matters. And I thought, okay, so if you were going to really dig deep and go at a granular level against what is in fact inside all of us, my nerve looks like your nerve. A heart ventricle is a heart ventricle. A spleen is a spleen. And I started to look through microscopes and look at this material, which to me presented remarkably as something extremely abstract, but at the end of the day really is something that has to do with a great certainty. And so the idea that you could actually make something visually that presented as one thing, but that represented a kind of scientific certainty was a tension that I was interested in exploring. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write this book, I'm going to make these paintings, and I'm going to see if I can actually dig a little deeper. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to my friends who hopefully have some questions.
I just want to point out that when Jessica was making these paintings, which were obsessive, and something she'd never really done, certainly not with the subject matter, it was actually, when you read the book and you see the level of exploration in the painting, they connect in an amazing way. And they're really, truly beautiful. The book is as much an object as it is a spectacular thing to read. That's not a question.
Yeah. I have a question. In the book you use a term more than once of defamiliarization. And it's a term, as I recall, from Russian formalist theory. And I recall that it was first used, or the way I remember it being used, was Tolstoy's description of Natasha at the opera, the first time she goes there in War and Peace, and how he represents the opera looking so different to the eyes of a young girl seeing it for the first time. But I wanted to know what defamiliarization means to you with respect to design.
Such a good question. Now I think I should have had footnotes, and I should have had Julie help with the footnotes. I think that, design has become a kind of panacea, right? So we all live on the same platforms. We all ingest the same material. We're awash in media all the time. And so, designers like change. The public may not like the change that we make, but we like change. And so the idea that you would actually figure out a way to inflect on the unassuming public, we were talking about this in our podcast this week, that my partner, Michael Beirut, with whom I have a podcast called The Observatory, we were talking about the fact that the reason logos have become such a big problem in the world is that people look at them all day long. You have a logo. Everyone has a brand. It's become this really important thing to self-present visually. And if you wake up one morning and Instagram has designed their logo, He likened it to having a nose job while you were sleeping. And you look in the mirror, it's not your face anymore, right? And so people take these public displays of our work very personally. So I think to defamiliarize something on the surface has to do with understanding the cause and effect relationship of form and content. But I think the bigger, deeper issue is that how do we individualize anything when we participate in this kind of visual grammar and this vernacular that is not necessarily of our own choosing? Everyone's Facebook page looks alike. Everyone writes in the same font on email. So it seemed to me that there's some interesting conversation that maybe hasn't happened yet that has to do with the relationship between that which is universal and that which is unique. And you might actually make the argument, as I'm about to make, that the things that succeed best and with the greatest longevity exist at the fulcrum of those two things. Right, so you do something that people expect, but then there's some slippage. There's some other thing that happens. I'm not sure that's your definition of defamiliarization, but I just quoted Victor Lasky, who was the person who wrote about it that I knew, but I didn't know about Tolstoy. So that's a really great
Lasky used Tolstoy as one of his examples in some of his writings. But they weren't the design part; it was like the literary.
Well, what do you think?
I think it's interesting to think of casting things anew. You talk about the problems of the international style creating a kind of neutral mold, but that also puts more responsibility on the user of the object to make it their own.
Right.
And then it's surprising how even in a very neutral object, how many different ways we can perceive it. We in the audience of design will look at an object and use it. It kills me, that there are all these different typefaces because, now in the world, because when I started in graphic design, of course, writing about it, thinking about it, there were so relatively few, and yet there were so many ways in which they were used. It could always be made to look strange, no matter how normative it was.
Right.
Yeah, well,
I'm looking at you, Véronique.
The title of your book is really what posed me a lot of question, a lot of problem, and I was thinking, what's the relationship between design and desire? Sounds almost the same word, actually. And I went back to my own experience of experiencing design and desire at the same time, and for me, it's totally connected with my desire for modernism. That's how I encountered design the first time in my life. I was 8 years old or something like that. And it was the shock of modernity. I was in Europe, of course. And so I was thinking about that. And what is modernity? What is this? What's happening? I mean, we all know when we walk into an Apple store, for example, there's a moment there. And what is that moment where design expresses itself through this modernity, what I call modernity. And recently, this relates to actually your painting. I was in New York, and I went to the Apple store that's on the west side. That big cube is completely empty, huge, and there's only tables at the bottom with the little, very thin little iPads or whatever. And what was interesting, it was a moment of modernity because there was just nothing there. It sort of resonated with my emotion toward design. Because what they had done there was not so much the space, it was the people in it. They were all, the people who were working there, were taking care of, were all wearing green T-shirts. And I don't know, maybe you all know that because you're a New Yorker, but I just come from France. And they were talking to each other through Bluetooth or some sort of interaction, and there were about 20 of those green people with the green T-shirt, and it sort of reminded me of something very organic because it was design. It was not an object. The moment was a design moment in a way. And the relationship of the people, they talk to each other, and as I came with a question, and they bounced me through a lot of different people who had specialty and tried to answer my question, and that was a design moment. It was not about design, and I just felt that same emotion I felt the first time I saw a chair by Eames and Eames chairs.
So this is what concerns me, exactly what you described. There's designers today, I think, this is my opinion, and you can all disagree, are enamored, many of them, of the immersive desire-filled experiences we have when we look at things we covet, like an iPhone. Like we talk about platforms and services and environments and sustained engagements with the user and not letting go of anybody's customer loyalty because then they'll go shop at Levi's instead of where it's the fetishizing of that and of thinking that we are feeding the public something that they want and therefore that's a good thing that fails to take into consideration one extremely important thing, and that is consequence. So for me, in a way, that the core of this book is the idea that the cause and effect relationship that we talk about in economics, we talk about in climate change, we talk about in science, in the lab with proteins in Petri dishes, we don't talk about cause and effect deeply enough in design. And so I will give an example now, if I may. There's a film that just came out by a man named Peter Gallison, who's a historian of science at Harvard. He made this film. It's called Containment. It won a lot of awards. The film is actually a hot mess visually. All the designers in the audience will find a lot wrong with it. It's very inconsistent. It's visually weird. There's a lot wrong with it. But he made this film with a guy who is the head of the Visual and Environmental Studies program at Harvard, which is the closest they come to design. And the film is about one thing, and it is about the fact that there are something like 260 million cubic tons of nuclear waste that exist in the world. And no one's figured out a way to figure out how to mark where they are and where they go and where they get settled so that 5 years from now, 500 years from now, 5,000 years from now, we'll be able to tell people what's there and that it's toxic and that it's terrible. Mm-hmm. So we're not having those conversations. That to me is a design conversation, right? Will human beings be on the earth? Will we have languages? Is there a visual language, a hieroglyphic? Is there some kind of visual Esperanto that we can now... We should be having these conversations. And that is an extremely exaggerated example of consequence. But when I hear or read about or experience designers worrying about the sales figures of the thing they're making, I'm not saying that we every day have to think about the future of toxic waste, but this just knocked me out when I saw this film, and I thought that to me, that's the kind of conversation we should be having. There are many other conversations, not least of which are the ones that have to do with our students and the ethical boundaries of their work. So students are making things that are hip and subversive, and they put them out there in the world, and they're just not thinking about, particularly if you put your work out online, particularly given the fact that English may be the lingua franca, but it's not the only language we speak, that someone at the other end may misinterpret your subversive, hip, coded, cryptic graphic meaning, and it may actually have an impact that is nefarious. And it's not cool to have this conversation. It's just necessary to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So you raised two things. You had said something that I wanted to address, and the consequences conversation also addresses this, and now they're kind of a meeting of the minds of these two things I wanted to raise. One is that consequences implies responsibility. I mean, you do talk a lot about the responsibility of, or imply a lot of the responsibility of the designer, but what is the responsibility of the user? I mean, in this, in these situations, like you walk into an Apple store and you're given a choice of, basically 5 things, and, but it's the way it's displayed and the way it's sold to you and the way it's marketed implies this universe of choice. So what is the user's responsibility then when you've got this option of, these 5 things that have been, arguably, changed society?
But those things are designed for the user to respond to with desire. That's exactly the point.
Yeah. But that's not necessarily responsibility, or...
Well, the point is that in a lot of what Jessica was talking about before in terms of how things are then codified and appear, really what you're talking about is status.
Right.
And that we desire things that we think give us a certain level of status, and that the designer understands the codification and can express that to a degree. Sometimes they do it instinctively, sometimes they do it in a very studied manner through research. And that what's fascinating is how this thing has become so pervasive that it is consuming everybody's life more than I ever thought possible. For example, I grew up hating suburbia because suburbia was nothing about status and codification. I lived and grew up in a suburban neighborhood. If you didn't dress like the kids in school, and you didn't behave like the kids in school, and you didn't look like them, and you didn't do this thing one way or the other, you were sort of ostracized.
How'd that work out for you?
It's alive and well on Facebook. Facebook is suburbia.
Yeah, it is.
I mean,
it's really
it's
interesting.
like a complete designed codification, and people live in groups, and they get their information a certain way, and they behave a certain way, and they like things, and they don't like things, and that is the same thing all over again. Now, the question is that a result of lack of responsibility, or is that human nature? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it is not. I find it more, the thing I rebelled against is more pervasive and is everywhere, and it's virtual. It comes into my home whether I want it or not.
Right.
I could live on a cliff, and it'll still, somebody's going to put me in a little box somewhere.
Right.
So go ahead.
I'm done.
Yeah. So we've got 3 educators on the panel and 2 occasional lecturers. But I liked what you said about your story, from about Natasha experiencing the opera for the first time and seeing something through somebody else's eyes for the first time afresh. And I think some of us are parents here, so I think you get that experience a lot when you see things afresh through your children. I couldn't find it, but you have an anecdote in here about one of your classes where you asked your students if a piece of design had ever made them cry.
Yeah.
And what was the response? You talk about, you go off course a little bit after you say that. But now I don't remember what.
So, the background...
And how, where were those kids, where were those students in their design education? Like how
That I don't remember.
Okay.
I probably don't pay enough attention to that, because I just say anything to anybody, because I think these are important things to have conversations. I have had them with my children since they were very young. But I grew up in a family with a father who was a collector of posters, and I was a very tiny little person, and I grew up with these giant posters that had, pointing fingers and skulls and crossbones and things that said, "Take this drug or you will get syphilis and die." Like, that was my introduction to the world, to typography, and it was theatrical and it was mesmerizing, and they were the scale that I still think, and particularly in France, you see these amazing kiosk posters which we don't produce in this country. And many years later, I went to graduate school at Yale, where the prevailing wisdom was that you didn't rock the boat, that modernism had come about for a reason, that our forefathers had bravely fought against the excesses of ornament, and make no mistake, only use Helvetica. Any questions? I don't think so. And there I was trying to square the evolution of this passionate collector father and his amazing collection, and being awash in an incredible tradition of design that was so emotional, with this very neutral international style fallout. And it occurred to me that, and this is actually in the book, I talk about, as you rightly say, that we talk about work being human-centered, and we talk about work mattering to people. We can't possibly strip it of all that emotional connection to what is humanity. And the example that I gave in the essay that's in the book is a wonderful poster by a man named Fred Spear from 1915 after the sinking of the Lusitania. And all it is a woman. It's an illustration of a woman, and she's underwater. And so her clothes are sort of swirling, and she's cradling an infant, and underneath it says, "Enlist." That's all it says. It's enlist, 7 letters. Right? And this had happened after the sinking of the Lusitania. This woman had been drowned in this, death hold with her infant, and no one had thought to separate them. And I made the point that nor should emotion be separated from design. That really there's, what is so bad about the theatrical impact of an image that is so resonates with you as a human being. And I think that's what I tried to do with many of the essays in this book, was look at experiences that had visual components. Why does a passport have visual authority in a world where everything is digital? What is it about paper trumping digital? When it's ephemeral, what is it about the notoriety of that thing, the permanence, the gesture of permanence of paper? I wanted to look at why it's so hard why we live in a world where co-creating and working in teams is always heralded, but somebody had to have the original idea. Why is that bad? Like an aha light bulb moment is still something we should be proud of. That's what it is to be human. It's to have an original idea. I may have to join the witness protection plan after this book comes out because there are a lot of critical things in it about some of the things that we take hook, line, and sinker. But I think that emotion and crying. I did share with a friend of mine this essay, which originally when I published it was called "Can Graphic Design Make You Cry?" And he said, "I think a lot of my clients cry all the time, but I don't think that's what you meant when you titled this essay."
Explain why you hate design thinking so much.
I hate buzzwords, and I hate systems that are replicated just so people can pat themselves on the back. I'm about to start teaching a new series of classes at Yale where I'm banning Post-it notes. I hate whiteboards. And so I think design thinking has become such an overused thing, and I'm all for design in business and having currency in worlds outside design. I think preaching to the converted is actually a really narrow-cast way for us to think about the world, and I remember a time when design wasn't on the front page of the Harvard Business Review and wasn't something that really was, I think, of valid interest, really vital interest to normal people. But I think it's so easy to just lay back and say, drag and drop, template, design thinking, everything as a system, and I'm going to have the next killer app. I think it's time to ask some ruthlessly critical questions about how we call what we do and why it matters to other people. And I think the things that link us together may have more to do with some kind of human prerogative, which is to make a choice, to have an original idea, to not be afraid to be emotionally invested in your work, to paint bone marrow. I was showing this to my design students. I just want to deviate for a second, and they said, why bone marrow? And I said, all right, let's talk about emotion. What if I told you that was my bone marrow? Okay, now what if I told you that was your bone marrow? Okay, now what if I told you that was the bone marrow of someone with leukemia? Okay, now that person with leukemia is 90. Okay, now that person with leukemia is 9. At each step of that phase. And we designers talk about the relation between words and pictures all the time, but that idea that the incredible impact of a link between an emotional experience, a reading, a story, we get narrative storytelling, comes from the heart, comes from an individual experience. So the tension for me is often how you make a logo, a brand, a design system, something that's going to live and something that's going to have a long purview for many people, and connect it to a reality that's not really about anything long because we change too quickly. So I think some of these questions for me really have to do with getting at looking really deeply in a different kind of way. And I should say also that the book that I wrote after this, before this, which I wrote the day Obama was elected, it came out, so many years ago, was a book on the history of scrapbooks. I don't know if they have any of them here, but I know they have some of my other books here tonight. And I think in a way this is an inversion of that. This is like a different kind of visual portrait. We all self-present as a bundle of cells. We all participate in a world that is a human world. Why are we trying to look at everything in terms of a disenfranchised set of idioms of, whenever I read about eyeballs and, bounce rates on websites and eyeballs, we're not a kit of parts, we're people, sentient people who can make choices, who can make decisions, who can understand consequence in terms of lasting impact, and design has to fit into that, to me, in a better way than just branding for tomorrow. I think it's got to be a much deeper, bigger conversation.
I was thinking coming here and downstairs, crossing the store, it hit me, the desire for, all those books are so, and we are all sort of like an organism downstairs. I'm talking downstairs, we have all the piles of books, and the sense of the desire, I desired all those books. It was actually envy. Yeah. It had the desire, and we are all the people that are buying the downstairs, and the customers go, the movement, the very relationship that we had with paper. You said with the actual thing. There's something about designing something that people can own, can touch. That's why design and graphic design. There's an interesting thing to think about. A thing you can buy, a thing you can pay money, and a book is an artifact. We talked about your book being an artifact as much as being a book.
Yeah.
And I think this desire for ownership that I experience again
But
downstairs.
don't you think that in the age of Pinterest, like I grew up in a family of collectors. Like it used to be, if you wanted a Paul Klee drawing, you went to Swan, you went to Christie's, you couldn't afford it, you
Yeah.
coveted it, you maybe looked in the catalog, maybe someone you knew owned it, you saw it in a museum. Now, if you want every Paul Klee drawing ever made, you can have a Pinterest board. So, I mean, there's a different conversation to be had about the art market and what that means. You
Yeah.
might have some opinions about this.
Yeah.
But I think that suddenly connoisseurship and consumership and amassing and owning and digitizing, and there's a story in the New York Times a year ago about a woman who was in some stress reduction clinic. She was young, like in her 20s. And one of the people running the clinic said, so when was the last time you had fun? She said, well, I went on vacation last year. And he said, oh, really? Where did you go? And she said, I went to Hawaii. And he said, what did you do? And the woman said, I took a lot of pictures of sunsets, and I look at them all the time. But I didn't look at them when I was there because, it's a perfect example, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is not okay with me. I mean, I don't think that visual culture it's not going to end well.
Yeah.
It can't.
I was reading the chapter that you wrote about solitude with great interest because I'm actually working on a project now involving hermits. And it came about because I was asked to write about tiny houses and the history of tiny houses. And I realized that the people who really started the tiny house movement weren't people who were living in yurts. Everybody lived in a yurt. They weren't people living in caves. Everybody lived in a cave. They were people who elected to live very small and in a way where they downsized and they got rid of their possessions. So when you said in your introduction that we are what we desire, it was so interesting to me because I've been thinking a lot about people who are desiring very little in the way of material possessions, but a great deal in another realm, in a spiritual realm.
They think they will gain by downsizing. They'll gain in some other way.
Well, exactly, because they think of all the possessions. I mean, if we're talking about true hermits, we're thinking about people who think that the possessions of life are standing between them and their spiritual, connection. When that could be with God, it could be with nature. It doesn't have to necessarily be religious, but it is spiritual. And I wanted to link it to people who are obsessed with tiny houses right now, and that's a whole other conversation. But
It's not. It's actually important because dwelling is so at the core of this. Go on, say more.
Well, just that notion. I mean, if you're a designer and you're so invested in material objects, here you are now, you basically shot every piety in the kneecap in your book, including the one that distinguishes designers from
Ergo,
artists.
witness protection plan.
Yes. And the fundamental one is that whatever designers are, and God knows there are so many different things, they're people who create things that are functional. And now you're showing us pictures of your artwork, and describing what its function is, but very, very personal to you, because it's a teaching tool, it's a demonstrative tool.
Well, also, it's for me a vehicle for learning more about something I know nothing about, which is science. And I grew up in a family of scientists, so for me, it's like probably a part of my midlife crisis. But I'm really interested in. I mean, I could go into this, but operationally, the paintings they begin with a substrate on a slide, and they end with me painting on top of a photograph or projection. So I'm very interested in that kind of binary relationship to form, but designers always care fetishistically about form. It's not necessarily key, but there's a functionality to those paintings for me because they took me to microscopes and to talk to pathologists and to understand what is the mitochondria and how does it work and how do cells work, how do cells divide. And it's incredibly humbling when you start to read about these things, and I thought that would be a good place to go to understand, because I think, look, a lot of designers think they're God. We make beautiful things that people covet. That elevates our value in society. But that value is so evanescent. It can't, because it doesn't come from something to me, unless it does, and I think it should, and it is in this conversation,
but
coming from a deeper place.
I don't agree with you. I think that desire is humbling. When I desire something that I can't buy, or I just look at it, it's so beautiful, that desire is actually makes me more human. So I feel that that's a good thing about designing something extremely beautiful that you can never own. I used to desire the tulip chair by Saarinen. I don't know why. It really drove me as a young person, and it elevated me to desire this chair, which I never bought, and actually was not such a great chair, but I desired it, and it defined who I was, the desire. So I'm not sure I agree with you I mean, you have, yeah, of course I agree with you, but at the same time also...
You're obligated to agree with me because you're sitting up here.
At the same time, I don't agree. I think the desire I felt entering this store downstairs and seeing everybody sort of touching the books, touching the covers.
But that's an interesting place because this is anti-Apple Store here because they're books, right? You have to sit with the book. You have to imbibe a book. It requires a different kind of timetable. So this actually is kind of interesting.
But it was the same thing as going into the Apple Store. It was the desire itself that was elevating me, not the thing that I desired. The fact that I was, thanks to whatever, I mean, think of all the people who designed the book covers.
Do you think there are limits to design?
The what?
Limits to that. Limits to what the things that people can make and
Yeah, because we don't have enough money to buy all the things we desire. So
for you, it's an economic argument.
But
it really comes, no, it's really, because I don't really talk about that a lot in the book, but it's true. It is a very particular facet of design.
I love knowing there are beautiful things I will never be able to afford. It makes me feel human. I always remember, I tell that story, Yves Saint Laurent came out with a dress about 20 years ago, which was a big black dress with a very sinuous, with a huge pink bow in the back. I don't know, it's a famous dress. And a girlfriend of mine said, I would never wear that. And I said to her, you're not supposed to wear it. This is not for you to wear, it's for you to look at it. It's for you to be shocked by this dress. But she said, no, I don't think I could wear that. I don't have the lifestyle to wear that. But I felt that what was great about that dress was the desire it created for something we could not attain. So anyway, maybe I'm just...
But that's aspirational, though. I mean, that's like looking at the thing and imagining a form of perfection that you see yourself in. As I was fascinated by Pinterest as an analogy because my team and my partners are pinning stuff all the time as reference, which is sort of this strange kind of...
I hate Pinterest.
Well, it's like visual hoarding. You know, this is because you can, so you sort of get more of it, and you don't edit it because it doesn't have any value because you didn't have to pay for it. You can put more and more on there, and yet I always found if I saw something that I thought was inspirational, I always referred to it better not having it. Because you had the space to remember it and misinterpret it. You had the ability to make the mistake. If it's all available to you, you've actually become a functionary.
That's a really good point.
In the hoarding. The hoarding comes right onto your piece of paper, and there you are.
And your paintings are sort of, I mean, you celebrate that slippage between the reality and the aspiration and the interpretation.
Well, for me, it's about time. That I think that it takes time to make a painting. It doesn't take the same kind of time to make a design, and that the act of doing it becomes more important than the result of it. A commission design is something where you have this outer responsibility, so that you're delivering something. If you make a painting, you're not delivering anything. If somebody hangs it up on the wall, that's their business. It's not. They're not the same act. That if you make the things for the book, I know because I was with you during the period you were making these. The making of them was as important as whatever the meaning was, and that's a different act.
What I thought was interesting, and I'll shut up after, in your book is the relationship you had with the paintings, where you did not come out and talk about the painting. They were there. They were talk about desire. They were there, rubbing against the text, rubbing against my experience of reading your book, and they were there, and you did not say you didn't sign them.
Right.
Why did you do that? How come you didn't say these are my paintings?
I went to Quaker school. It's not what we do. Seriously.
But it was interesting for the reader to not know what we were.
It was an exploration. It was a body of work. I've been interested in stem cells for a very long time.
Okay.
It's probably my attempt to try to understand science through art. I thought the idea of looking inside, where we're all the same, was the journey. And building a body of work. I mean, I would look at these images that would be blown up 40,000 times,
and then I would move around and try to find the piece that I wanted to replicate.
I completely agree with you, but you didn't say that in your book.
I'm saying now, no,
Why?
Because I wanted the arguments to be more universal than about just my paintings. I'd love to have a show of the paintings, I'm not going to lie. If there are any gallerists here, come talk to me afterwards. But I just thought the idea was to stand still and dig deeper, and to look at the universalities. I mean, this is a body of work I'm continuing with. I want to paint bigger, I want to paint more things. I learned so much, but there's something so enormously humbling about writing about trading hubris for humility and trying to find that place where we all connect. Black, white, gay, straight, fat, thin, rich, poor, it does not matter. And that to me was just the most marvelous exploration, and it never occurred to me to have a whole thing that said, and then I painted the pituitary gland. Like, there's actually an index in the back that explains, in my very fledgling neophyte way, where I think, there were actually, scientists at Oxford about 2 years ago discovered a place slightly behind the eye, where they think the conscience lives. So, there's this painting at the beginning of the book that's a piece of an eye, because we think we experience the world visually through the eye, but the decisions we make, the ethical boundaries of how we shape choice, are maybe millicenters, it's right close by, and we never talk about that. So, I don't know, maybe it was a mistake, but to me, these were parallel explorations.
I wish you had written all of that in the book.
Maybe I'll wait for the movie. Can we open this up for questions? Are we ready for questions? Answers? Discussions? Gallerists? Hello, Elena.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I can't help but I have to ask you if when you were working on the paintings, you were thinking about how they would reproduce.
Constantly. The paintings are painted larger than the book, but in the same aspect ratio. Once a designer, always a graphic designer. But yeah, I was very interested in how they reproduce, and always a hard thing to do, but I think an important thing to do. And having them photographed was important, and photographing them a certain way was important. And they were, for every painting I painted, I rejected about 4 other paintings, so there's many more. Yeah, I've never done a book where I painted the illustrations before. This is a first for me.
Well, it sort of makes, because, I don't know why, but there's a connection to information design.
Yeah.
And I think that in that way, maybe you're sort of challenging the information graphics trend by...
Sure, you could write that on my Amazon page. That'd be great. Let's bring in some information design, snarky comments.
Yeah, I'm sure you love the buzz. I was going to say infographic, but ow. So yeah, that's a really sort of big thing, and it's the one thing in design that I think right now is absolutely trapped in the international style.
Right.
And so...
Right. Good. Really good point. Elena was my graduate student many years ago, so she knows I'm like secretly grading her here. That's actually really... We clean up so much. I mean, when I say desire is messy, it is messy. She just admitted that she covets stuff she can't afford. It's messy because it looks like bone marrow. It's messy. It's not, and we tend to clean up a lot of things. And so maybe, that's actually a very good observation, because I think there's an opportunity to really go for this emotional, make you cry. I mean, I actually got very emotional when I saw them in the book for the first time. So, you're a designer, you're designing it, I'm writing it, I'm editing it, I'm doing everything, one-man band, playing all the instruments. And then the first time I actually saw the paintings in the gutter, I kind of choked up.
Yeah.
Because suddenly it was like painting as book.
Yeah.
Which was never, I never looked at, I was a little worried about where they would hit the gutter, but...
It's actually true. The gutter transformed the
it sort of dimensionalizes them in a different kind of way.
It turns into an object.
And it, I don't know why, but...
Hi.
I'm really interested in the differences between the desire and consumer-driven design and the desire of science. I think that in terms of, we've talked a lot about consumerism and actually design being used for that, for those purposes of the problems that's very problematic with that. Where do you see design in the science realm going and as a positive thing, with your example about, being able to communicate things that are going future?
I think it's a huge opportunity. Well, it's a really great question. So scientists have now at their disposal incredible tools to look very deep into all sorts of cells and cell structures in laboratories. They don't have design training, and nor should they, but everything is RGB, and the minute you actually take the RGB out of it, the red, green, blue palette, and you look at this stuff in one color, in two colors, and you dimensionalize it through the skills that designers have, it's an incredible asset, I think, to amplify the information that they're looking at. I have an appointment at Yale where I'm the artist in residence at a place called the Center for Network Science. And I work with these scientists. And what's interesting about people working with big data now is that they all have to talk to each other. So if a guy in public health has to talk to somebody in sociology, has to talk to somebody in computer science, they're all looking at their little nodes and lines, and they know what all the data means, but they can't communicate. And so there's this incredible opportunity for visual language to enter into that dialogue. And it's been a great privilege for me. There are days when I feel like a total foreign exchange student, but I literally gave a lecture last week on the dotted line. So all these postdocs, 3 of them have won MacArthur's. It was unbelievable because they were really listening like, oh, the dotted line. The dotted line is ambivalent. The dotted line is parenthetical. The dotted line is a whisper. And we had this interesting conversation about like a very pure kind of graphical language in concert with these tremendously deep, important ideas in their publishing papers in Nature. But it's extremely crude what they do visually. And to the extent that if you take that Instagram feed, everybody has visual literacy metaphor, and you raise it to the next level, they need to up their game. And so,
Engagement in science.
and exactly.
Because, so I'm a science communicator, but that's what I study.
And are you finding that also?
Well, I'm studying graphic design at the moment, trying to how I can actually do this.
They need you. I think it's the next big explosion in a discipline.
But I think what's the main issue is that there is no engagement or desire for people to actually know about how much wastage there is in the world, because they're so busy on Pinterest with consumer getting sucked in by design.
Right. It's very myopic.
I just wanted to see kind of how do you see, is there a way that we can engage? How do we get people wanting to desire to know about this information, and then how do we actually go about communicating?
Well, this whole thing about the sharing economy, which is always really, we talk about this, about how a little democracy is a good thing, but sometimes, expertise is good. It's really great to say, I don't know science, but I know design. You know science, so let's have a conversation. I'm trying to set up these clinics at Yale where we bring in designers and scientists, and we do a sprint. We do a one-day sprint. We say, here's a problem. Make this visually better, but make it clearer. And can the designer talk to the scientist, talk to the engineer? And then we do a critique, and we introduce the culture of critique into the science world. I will not say space, I hate that. The science space. The science world, because this is a discipline. We have a discipline, they have a discipline. The sharing economy should penetrate those disciplines, and we need to have these kinds of collaborations where there's mutual respect, and the designer is not brought in later to pick the curtains, but actually exists at a systemic level. Get Paula in a room talking to these guys. The work's going to be better.
I hate to tell you this, Jessica, but I spent a year working for the Union for Concerned Scientists, and they were one of the worst clients I ever had. It was just a nightmare. I mean,
You think you had the wrong scientists?
No, I think that their expectation of communication is very different, and that you get into that stratosphere of what they think looks scientific, and that has to do with what their milieu is. That they're in a milieu where things function and look a certain way, and if you change that to make it more communicable to a mass audience, it's actually very threatening. Yeah. It's a fascinating thing because they're really no different from anybody else. That people live in their jurisdictions, and they move very incrementally to another direction. I remember trying to explain design to my father, who was he was a map maker and an amazing scientist, and he would not. If you made something readable, he would actually be against it because he didn't think it was believable as science.
No, this is exactly what happened to me. So the first time I met with these people, I redesigned posters. A scientific poster is not what a designer would call a poster. It's like
extremely dense, like the Gutenberg Bible on one surface. And this amazing guy from the University of Tokyo, MD, PhD, like has done everything, shows me this poster. It's a piece of junk. And I did it before and after. And he looked at me and he said, Jessica, I have to say, if I did what you just did to my poster, no one would take me seriously.
Yeah.
And I said, that's the conversation we need to have. Like, I'm not going to dumb down your work. We need to come to the middle and figure out how design can amplify, clarify, solidify your work, and not just be the person who makes it pretty and less important. And that's I think it's going to take a long time. Paula's right. I mean, this is an uphill climb. But, maybe you're a young woman. Maybe in your lifetime you'll see it change.
In France, the book design, the covers of the books is really, really bad. Into a bookstore, I can say that. It's so bad. So once I spoke to a French publisher and said, how come you don't come and look, see what we do in the States? The book covers are so extraordinary. Books are packaged in this country in a beautiful way. I mean, I like to buy them all. But the publisher says to me, if we did what you do in the States, people would not take the literature seriously.
It's the same argument.
Yeah, it's just exactly the same thing. And we have to have books that are slightly awkward looking, because that way people know it's serious literature.
Yeah.
So we have a problem.
We have a problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem. Thank you for helping us identify a big problem. Now I'm truly depressed. Next question. Hello, Steve.
Hello. You're obviously very passionate about this. I'm wondering, with the book being done now, do you hope for a specific result, or is it really enough just to kind of get the ideas out there?
I hope to not have to join the witness protection plan. The jury's still out on that. I've been saying recently that I want to change the conversation, but I also want to change the way the conversation happens. So in design culture, for those of you who are not designers, there's, as in many cultures, there's a lot of experts on the stage at the podium, people in the audience, elite designers talking to up-and-coming. I'm sick of that, and I feel like this is a crucible moment. This is serious. I think that there's a different way to teach. There's a different way to have the conversation. I want to go around and talk to schools. I want to have town meetings. I want to do one-day sprints where I go in to do consulting, not me, the expert, but me working with a team of designers to change things. I just think the kinds of things we think about and talk about need to change. That would make me happy. I would feel like that actually made an impact on. Look, the studio as an incubator for form, it's great. It's a little bit in the classic model of the 19th century. I think it's a little bit of a deep freeze, but designers have to make. They have to draw. They have to put in the Malcolm Gladwell's 9,000 hours to become experts. That's not going to change. But I think the things we think about have to change, and the conversations we have to change, and the work we do maybe as a community and with other communities has to evolve in kind. I think just saying I'm a social designer or I care about design for good, it's so meaningless. What does it really mean? I think we really have to ask ruthlessly critical questions, and I tried to ask some of them in this book because I think it's time. And then I'll join the witness protection.
Can I also say something else? What I like most about Jessica's book was, while I was reading it, I was questioning myself. I was not just reading you. It was a double reading. I was reading you, and I was reading my reaction to what you said, and that was a double activity, which I never experienced in any other book about design. You sort of created. It was not a mirror. It was just a resonance. I could resonate, and it was not comfortable. You like that?
I like that, and I think I want people to have their own anecdotes. Like, I'd like to be able to get up right now, and walk out, and have you all talk. To me that would be success, right? I want it to be a different way of talking about. I think the work will get better. The things we contribute to the world will get better. The ways our impact will be made sensible will get better. And the next generation. I've taught for a long time, and so I think there's a whole pedagogical quality to this about. I want my students to be asking different kinds of questions. This whole thing began for me when I was on a jury in Amsterdam, and a student had made a project where he was about to win the big prize, and forgive me for those of you who've seen, there's a film on my website about this, but he was about to win a very big design prize, and he had taken like a terrorist video of guys in flak jackets with guns, and because he was such a good, skilled maker, he had stripped out the type and put in his own legend, like bad, ugly, not good type, bad, ugly, bubble type. And he wanted to use this fake trope thing that he had sort of twisted to fund a revolution on Kickstarter. Right? So everybody on the jury thought this was great, and I thought this was morally reprehensible, and I went crazy. I thought, look, it's subversive, it's great. No, it's not great. This is a student who doesn't understand that the thing he's making, that he's borrowing this cultural terminology, visually, extremely powerful, vituperative visual language, and he's putting it out there. Who is going to see it at the other end, and how are they going to interpret it? And what will then happen in that? I mean, our students, look, students are myopic, they have to be, they work hard. But we don't have to be. That's our job as educators, as parents, as writers, as thinkers, as people who are seeding conversation, is to maybe stop and ask some ruthlessly objective questions that have to do with the ethics and the boundaries by which our work exists. And students being designers to just be cool and do cool work, they could have nefarious consequences. I think it's time to be unpopular and be the person who says, no, that's not cool. That does not win the big prize. It's an interesting thing for him to talk about with his students, but we cannot endorse something that potentially could have an impact that's really, really evil. And I know I'm over-exaggerating, but to me that was a really exaggerating example. I thought, I just write a book about this. We have to talk about this.
In talking down the jury?
I did. It took me, I shut down the conversation for 2 hours, and he didn't get the award. I mean, he got an award, but he didn't get the big prize. And I thought, I have hit a nerve. We have to have different kinds of conversations. It's not just that it looks good. Designers win awards. Designers prize other designers. We preach to the choir. We want stuff to look good. Desire is all about material culture, but it's got to be about a human prerogative that exists on a much deeper level. And that's, I don't know, I think that's an important conversation to start to have in concert with our work being important and good and looking great and selling and making us all rich and famous, but it has to be about more than that. And now I'm going to move to Canada.
Before you moved to Canada.
Hello, Adam. God, I know everybody here.
So you talked about the messy, contradictory emotions of different objects. A bit of a slippage between the object and the messy, contradictory self. But the other way around, do the objects influence our emotional state? And if they do, is there a sort of international style of emotion that is being projected from the object?
What do you think? That's a good question for Paula. What do you think?
I think it goes back to status. I mean, I think that oh, I'm sorry, I never lean forward into these things. I think there is a codification of object and socioeconomic groups, and that you respond to things in specific ways because you've been trained to and don't even know it. What's desirable is somewhat personal and also part of this broader thing that you've come to desire because you've seen other people desire it, or you've been told it's terrific, or you don't even know how you know that, and that it isn't you being where you are and how you live and who you know is as much a part of it as the object, and I think that's inescapable, and that it's also very painful because if you feel you don't do that, you suddenly don't belong, and our society is filled with that. So how do you separate yourself from that and make objects neutral? How do you look at the world and make value judgments when you are going to desire things because you're part of a group and you see things a specific way? That's sort of the tension, and I think that's been around for a long time. I remember that my whole life.
Mm-hmm. So do you try to make design objects that aren't neutral, that have a little bit more friction?
We were having this conversation the other day, Michael Beirut and I, about this thing called best practices, to which I always say best to whom? Like, who says they're best? It's like Jerry Seinfeld used to talk about the Department of they, like, they say it will rain. Is there a they somewhere in Congress? And I sort of feel this way about design. So you have to, Michael was saying, if you're an architect, a door is how you get into the house. You're not going to read about the door and put it on the ceiling. But when you read about UX, UI, and signage constraints and everything, it always concerns me that there's something a little fascist about at what point do we assume that language is the language that will work for everybody? And I just think, I don't know, I think those are good conversations to have, right? I mean, wayfinding is important. You need to find your way in the Madrid airport or you will end up in Kyrgyzstan instead of going to Portugal. But I think at some point we can't just assume that, and this is my argument against design thinking, right? So formulas, systems, grids, consistency is a good thing, but it is also the hobgoblin of little minds. We have to just keep those conversations open and not just kowtow to what we think is best. Best practices is a really scary term to me. I like worst practices. Messy practices. Am I getting the high sign? One more question, says Kaylin. And make it a good one. Hello.
Okay, so I was kind of interested in what you said about the emotion of design and like design making pride. And I think the thing design and advertising that I immediately thought of is like co-commercials and stuff like that are trying to like pull at your heartstrings and like all those ads. And is it like if it's getting people to think about the message that they want and their charities that they're trying to raise money for, do you think that that's enough, or because it is kind of just making people buy clothes more? So that's.
There's I'm not trying to like do a big plug for Yale here, but there's a guy at Yale who's written a book. He's working on a book on empathy, and I love his name is Paul Bloom, and he says, people ask him, Paul, what are you working on? He says, I'm working on a book on empathy. I'm against it. I love this guy. So this is directly gets to your question, and I wish he were here because he could answer it so much better. But he basically says that my cat died. Aww, all of this stuff. He calls it. He has a great word like short burst altruism. It's basically feel good empathy. Like, I'm going to feel good because there are Syrian refugees, and I'm going to say it's bad thing. Like, it's not meaningless. It is meaningless. And I think that his point is that you really need to step back and look really carefully at what it is you can do to make the world a better place, and just expressing your emotional, that's not empathy. You can't teach empathy. You can teach empathic listening. You could teach empathic behavior, but you can't actually teach empathy. I mean, maybe you can if you have an infant and you start from this ground up. I don't know that you could teach it in schools to adults. I don't know that you can teach it to your clients. But his point is that you have to take a long view of things. And so emotion, I mean, I'm sure it sells a lot of Coke in the cotton commercial. I mean, people cry at these things. But it's a short fix. It's a short-term fix. And it's very economically driven, and it's driven by lots of research, and far be it for me to talk about the vicissitudes of that, which are deep and complex. But I think that if you take a deeper, longer look, it's about something more. But you all may disagree.
Well, it gets to Paula's comment about the suburbanization of Facebook, because there was a point when something terrible would happen to people, and you'd be so awkward about how do you express your empathy, and you would reach into your soul and you would come up with the words to express it. And now you get onto Facebook and everybody has the same mantra: my thoughts and prayers are with you. And it might be absolutely sincere, but it also has now taken on this gloss of the appropriate thing to say.
Here's what you do. I'm going to tell you all. What you do is you don't do anything on Facebook. You pick up the phone, you write a letter, and you have an individual relationship to that person. Same with birthdays. I mean, just because it's there doesn't mean the cake is on the table. You don't have to eat another slice, right? And I make this argument, I think, in the book that there's a way to be reactive, and there's a way to be reflexive, and there's a kind of reflexiveness. Twitter does this to us. So like the feed is coming really fast. You have to keep up. You have to express your solidarity with the person whose cat died. Maybe there's another way to do it. And I think that's, again, a human prerogative. It doesn't have to happen digitally, online, all the time. Personally.
Agree.
Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to sign books if any of you want one.